can you hear me well and see me well? Okay, perfect. Then my lecture will be about typical Catalan pawn structures. And I think we should always try to study the opening by starting with the pawn structures. And that's why we decide to start with this lecture. Okay, let's go to the first position. With some transposition, we get the typical Catalan opening after d takes c4. So in the first few examples, we will see positions where white has a slight advantage and initiative, but without sacrificing material. And the second part of the lecture we'll see positions where white actually sacrificing one or two pawns to take the initiative. Okay, in this position, white has a lot of moves. This is an old game between Yuri Sakharov and Georgy Borisenko. Someone said that it cannot see the first rank. Is this better now? Okay, you'll tell me if there's no. So everyone can see the first rank, or yeah. So everyone said that everything is visible. So please check again. Yeah, it should be fine. Okay, write me in chat if there are any problems. Okay, this is the starting position of the variation. I told you there are a lot of moves. We'll check even some of them later, but the old theory and still the main line is the move queen a4. So white is putting some pressure on the diagonal and wants to take the pawn on c4. And here black has a choice between two moves. Let's see. The first one is c takes d4. According to theory, this is not enough for equality because of knight takes d4, the small trick, queen d4, and then bishop c6. We take, okay, we're not winning by force because black is not forced to take on c6. Black plays bishop d7. And then white has a strong move. Can you guess what's the best move in this position? Let's see how well you know the Catalan theory. What's the best move for white? Yeah, okay, almost all of you get it very quickly. Yeah, rook d1 here. And according to theory, this is better for white in both cases. If bishop c6, then queen takes c6, pawn takes c6, rook d4, rook d8, rook takes c4. So we will see this structure later in the lecture where black's pawns on the queen side are weak. They cannot defend each other, and those endgames are always quite unpleasant for black. So this position is not winning, but a very big advantage for white already. The other option is to sacrifice the queen, and it's very interesting. I tried myself a few times, but it's not enough. It seems that it's not enough, and white with an accurate play black with accurate play can come close to equality, but it's not full equality. So okay, let's get back to the game. Queen c4. And here, in modern days, the most popular move is b5. b5, queen d3, then rook c8. So black is not taking on d4. In old days, they took on d4. And why this move is bad? It looks very natural. Our pawn on c5 is under attack. We just exchange it. And then knight d4. That way, we open the Catalan bishop. So this bishop on g2. And white's pieces are very active. The knight on d4 is active. The bishop on g2 is very active. White has some pressure on the queen side. Rook c8, knight c3, queen a5. Yeah, and after c takes d4, knight takes d4. Here we have the first structure, which we will see today. It's so-called open center. It's a symmetrical structure where both c and d pawns are exchanged, and it's again very close to equal, but white has some pressure. White's pieces are more active, and also white's king is safer while black's king is still stuck on e8. So it's not equal. Let's say white still keep an advantage. For example, here black can try queen b6, the knight c6 take, bishop e3, and the pawns on the queen side are vulnerable. Now the pawn on a7 is hanging. Queen b2 is losing because of rook b1, queen a3, knight b5. And if queen b4, then we exchange and we win a pawn. Okay, he can take it back, but then rook b1 and the pawn on b7 is weak. So, okay, now we get to the first position. It's black to move now. This is probably the first critical position in the game. What black should play? The bishop is under attack, so you need to move the bishop somewhere, but to which square? You can see different answers. So here, bishop e7 is the best move because the bishop here is protected. Still, white has some initiative because those bishops are looking at the queen side. It's not so easy for black to defend the queen side, but the bishop here is protected. Bishop b6 leaves the d6 square without protection. Here, probably knight b5 is strong, or even knight e4, knight c5. Oops. Wow. Sorry. I'm getting back to the position. So bishop d6 was played in the game. Here, the bishop is weak. Yeah, it gives white some tempest to attack it. Rook fd1, and then king e7. So another slow move. Now knight b5. We start typical pressure on the queen side. Knight b5, we're attacking the bishop, so bishop b8 is forced, and then knight c5. We're attacking the pawn on b7. So then b6 is simply bad, because knight d7, and rook c1. This is a dream position for the Catalan Opening. We have bishop pair, our rooks are quite active on c and d5, and those knights are not stable here. So also the king can be vulnerable. If the knight moves somewhere, then bishop b4 is possible. This is very bad. a6 was played, knight a3, the knight is going to c4, rook c7, knight c4. Bishop a7, and probably this is the last critical moment. So white here needs to stabilize his advantage. What's the best move for white? What do you think? Okay, I see different answers. Okay, a lot of suggested bishop f4. Probably here e5 is possible. Knight d7. It's better for white, but somehow black managed to stabilize the position. Still, white is better after rook c1. b4 is the best move. So there's a simple trick that after knight b4, knight d7, rook c4, knight e5. And this is very dangerous. Now bishop b4 and knight c6 is the threat. So the pawn is not hanging. He played knight d5, a3, takes, bishop f4. Rook c8, knight d6, and black already lose material, bishop c5, knight c8, take. And the rest was just technique, and black resigned in a few moves. Okay, this was the first example. You need to know that those positions, let's say, a lot of my students, they are always afraid of symmetry. So this symmetrical structure, this open center, it's very tricky. It's not equal at all. I mean, it's quite playable structure. We can reach it from Queen's Gambit accepted, and from other openings, and quite often from the Catalan Opening with the bishop on g2. So usually black needs to work hard to equalize this. We'll see one more example. Here, a game of Vasily Smyslov, and here queen a4. At all times, the advantage is mainly based on the piece activity And in this Catalan structures of the vulnerability of black's pawns on the queen side. So knight f3 now is the modern main line, and everyone knew that this pawn can be sacrificed, and white doesn't need to take it back immediately, but all the time they just take the pawn back. Now everyone here play a6, but back then c5. Knight f3, a6. So black's idea is always somehow to oppose to the bishop on g2. You will see this in all the structures. The bishop sometimes is going on c6, sometimes on b7. But to neutralize the bishop on g2, black needs to put the bishop on the long diagonal, the light square bishop on the long diagonal. So the threat right now is b5. And there is an old trick that a4 is not stopping b5. b5 is still possible because take, and now the queen is hanging, and the rook on a1 is hanging. So here white even loses. So queen c2. And now, okay, I will give you three choices. What do you think? What is the best move in the position? b6, b5, or c takes d4? I'll give you 20 seconds. Okay, I see different answers. So some of you guess it. Some not. Remember something. C takes d4 is a move that usually you want to avoid in Catalan with black. This move helps white because it activates our knight and also activates the bishop. b5, it's a good move when it comes with tempo. But in general, we prefer to have this pawn on b6. Because many times white can attack those pawns. This pawn is too advanced, and white can attack it with a4 and after b4 to get the square c4 for his knight. Also, the c5 pawn is not very well protected. The best move here is b6. It was played by Smyslov himself a few times. And the knight e5 trick is actually not giving much because of knight d5, knight c3, bishop b7, and the position is acceptable, let's say, for black. C takes d4. Remember, this is a common mistake. Try to avoid it. Knight takes d4. And then the main idea of c takes d4 is that now we can develop the queen or the bishop with tempo. So bishop c5 or queen b6. Queen b6 was played in this game, but bishop c5 is not better. Bishop c5, knight b3. Then bishop d6 to avoid bishop f4. And again, he has problem with this b7 pawn on this diagonal. Castles, knight c3, rook d1, bishop e3, and another quite unpleasant position. So here the problem with b5, for example, is that knight is going to a5 and then to c6. It's not so easy. White's pieces are very active. This bishop on c8 is not developed. Yeah, knight g4 is usually not so dangerous. You can always play bishop d4 and answer e5 with knight d5. So this is, again, big advantage. It's not so easy to finish the development. If the bishop goes to a7, then castles, bishop d2, tricky move. a3, threatening bishop b4, still bishop b4. Knight c3, and again, this is an advantage. Black cannot develop the c8 bishop, and the rooks are coming on c1 and d1. Those positions are really unpleasant. So queen b6 was played, knight b3, and then bishop b4 check. Okay, fast development. There's probably nothing wrong. Bishop d2. White can exchange that square bishop because then the weakness of the d6 and b6 squares will be important. Probably a5 needs to be played here. Still, white is slightly better. There are games. But knight c5 played in this game. Castles, knight b3, queen takes b3, bishop c5. And then again, we exchange and reach a classical position, an endgame without queens. No visible weaknesses for black, but very, very unpleasant position. So again, this bishop is strong. we have C and D files, and we need to activate the knight. So knight C3 or knight A3? One question. Where the knight should go? Okay, a lot of correct answers. Knight is going to C4. From C4, the knight attacks D6, A5, B6. Let's see how Smyslov crushed his opponent. Knight D5, trying to block the diagonal. One thing that you need to know, that this is not, first, always white can play E4. But also, if this knight is not stable here, always you need to think about E4 or even bishop D5. So knight D5 is usually not solving the problem. Here, knight C4, rook C1 is strong. E4, bishop C3 is what Smyslov chooses. Then rook F1, knight C6. Still, B5 is not possible because of E5. And rook B8, and then bishop A5. Very strong move. Another picturesque position. This bishop cannot go to D7, cannot go to B7. Rook C1 is coming. A b takes C4, bishop C7, bishop D6 is winning an exchange. So knight C6. E5, we're opening the diagonal. Again, B5 is not possible. And it's very hard already for black. F6 was played, but this looks active to exchange this pawn on E5, but actually this creates more weaknesses. Now E6 pawn is weak. F4, rook B8, rook AC1. So nothing special. And then knight E5. So why not taking with the pawn? Because then the pawn will be weak on E5. Knight E5, the idea here is to exchange everything. Here even bishop E5. And we leave only this bad bishop on the board, and the rook is going to C7. Rook C7, B4, bishop H3, H6. And then we can win a pawn, rook C8, bishop E6, but it wasn't enough for Smyslov. And he found a very nice technical move. Let's see if you can find what Smyslov played here. Okay, we have one suggestion. No, rook C8 is not the move. Okay, so few correct answers only. Rook C1 is possible. Probably black can play king H8 or bishop B7 just to sacrifice the pawn. White is better. Rook D6, white is better as well. But the move which Smyslov found just is quite strong. He exchanged the last active piece of his opponent. So the last active piece is the rook on F8. And he played rook F1. So take. This position is already extremely hard with those two pieces not playing, not taking part into the game. King F8, king F2, bishop G2, B3. A4 was some desperation, but just the king wants to go to C5 now. And okay, here Smyslov has a very good technique. He converted this without any troubles. After bishop E4, his opponent resigned. Okay, those were the only classical games which we will see today, the only old games. So this is the so-called open center. You should try to, my suggestion is try to avoid those positions if you are not 100% sure that your bishop can go to B7 or that you can activate the bishop from C8. Otherwise, those positions are without any counterplay and an advantage for white. Okay, now a few games from, we'll see a few games from the modern times. We will start with Vladimir Kramnik. I see one question. Yeah, there's a question, can it be considered a success to win the bishop pair in these structures and then try to move on and pressure those pawns? Yeah, usually it's a success to get the bishop pair. if you manage to exchange your knight for the dark square bishop, let's say sometimes knight d6 check, this is the quite common knight d6 check, if you imagine the structure, and then bishop d6, rook takes d6, and those positions are very, very hard. Usually, if we exchange the knight for the bishop on c8, then the pawn on b7 is hanging. So, yeah, bishop pair is a very, very big success in this structure. And now, one game, I try to show you structures which are not covered by Michael Marin in his databases. So I think this game is covered, but this is the only exception. So d takes c4, this is so-called semi-open Catalan. Let's talk about the Catalan theory just for a few seconds. There are three main types of position. There's d takes c4, which is so-called open Catalan. And now the modern theory is bishop g2. We're not trying to take the pawn immediately, first want to finish the development. The second one is bishop b4. Oops, well, here bishop b4, bishop d2, and bishop e7, so-called semi-closed Catalan. So it seems that black loses a tempo, but the bishop is misplaced on d2. This is the trick. Somehow the bishop is not very well placed on d2. This is quite popular nowadays. And together with the system with immediate bishop e7, take, and only after castle to take on c4. There are also positions with c6, which we will see later. So taking on c4, this was always the main line in Catalan. Black finished the development, and now white is trying to take the pawn back with queen a4, queen c2, or knight e5. And then black is playing a6 and b5. So Kramnik played in this position, queen c2, a6. And nowadays, I think most popular move here is a4. With this move, white is stopping b5, but then the b4 square is weak. Then the theory continues, bishop d7, and so on and so on. But always the main line was queen c4. This was also suggested by Grandmaster Marin. Then b5 comes with tempo, and the bishop is on b7. Bishop d2, knight c6. Here there are big choice for black. Bishop e4 and bishop d6 are the best move, I think. Knight c6 was played by Carlsen. The game is the game was played at 2007, so Carlsen was very young. e3, and then knight b4. Someone said that there's a forced draw. I don't think that there's a draw line. There are a lot of equal position or very close to equal, but always white has some small pressure. So knight b4, usually we don't need this bishop on d2, this dark square bishop. Sometimes we play bishop g5 and exchange it. Here after knight b4, we're happy to give bishop a3 and bishop e7. So in this structure, black has a backward pawn on c7. If black managed to play c5, let's say c5 takes and then takes somehow back, then the position is close to equal again. We reach this open center, but the bishop is on b7, so there are no weaknesses. Still, those endgames are sometimes quite unpleasant, but this is the way how black should try to equalize here. And white is trying to stop c5. Another move is bishop d6 in this position, to go back on d6. But then knight bd2, and sometimes e4, e5 is coming with a threat. So black needs to move the knight or the bishop again. So that's why bishop e7, knight d2. Again, if b4 right now, a5 is very strong. He managed to exchange the pawn on b4. Knight b2, rook c8. b4 right now, not allowing c5. And then a5, logical move. And here starts the interesting part. Can you guess what Vladimir Kramnik played with white in this position? Very well, Graham. Very well, Terry. Okay, so enough answers. You all suggested different moves. So let's try to understand what's going on. First, one move which was suggested was Queen B2. It seems playable, but then the B4 pawn became a weakness. Queen D6, probably later Knight D5. There are some games in this position, so it's not so easy to make a draw, but it's close to equal. There's also B takes A5. I think this is not good because C5 here. And after B takes C5, we can take on C5, we can take on A5. I think both takings are good. So it's not B takes A5. Knight D5 was the move played by Kramnik. And let's see what happened. The point is that Bishop G2, King G2, and here if A takes B4, we have Knight C6 and A takes B4. There is a game here between John Spielman and John Cox, and Black is almost lost here. There is no counterplay at all. The pawn on B5 is weak, the one on C7 is weak. It's very similar to what happened in the game. C6 was better. And then not taking the pawn, but Knight D3, and we managed to stop C5. This gives White significant advantage. Carlsen played Knight D5, which is mistake. It looks good. It looks very good, because now if Knight C6, we take it, we take on B4. But Kramnik prepared Knight B3. And after Knight B3, A takes B4. Probably this move was the next move was overlooked. Knight A5, attacking the bishop with tempo. Bishop A8. Knight C6, Bishop C6, Knight C6, Queen D7. And then Bishop takes D5. This is the only way to retrieve the pawn. But it's good enough, because Queen takes D5 is not possible. And after E takes D5, A takes B4. We already saw this position in the previous session. Black is completely paralyzed here. The pawn on B5 is impossible to be defended, and the C7 is weak. So in that level, this is just 1-0 here. Kramnik converted quite easy. T5, rook B5, okay, just a pawn up. And the second pawn, Bishop D6, Queen A5, rook B1, some tactics. Okay, Queen A4, and here Carlsen resigned. The pawn on D5 is very weak, so there's this annoying pin. Knight C6 is kind of a threat. Okay, so another structure which is simply winning for White. If you manage to stop C5 in this position, let's say if you manage to play B4 and then A5 is somehow not working, if it's your move and you play Knight B3 here, let's say he skipped the move, play H6, then you play Knight B3, and then it's very close to winning already, from a strategical point of view. Okay, then we continue with one game of Alexander Grishuk. We're not going to see it from the start, but it's again the same variation, just White played A4 instead of Queen C4. Queen C2 and then A5. This is quite typical move. So Black fixes the square B4. White won the pawn back on C4, but gave the B4 square for Black's pieces. Those positions you can see quite often nowadays, and they're very well investigated by the theory. Here, the concrete moves are not important at all. So you need to understand what's going on in the position. Okay, take a quick look, and I will give you around 30-40 seconds to tell me how White should continue. what is the correct plan for white? Or probably even two plans. Okay, still I cannot see a right answer. At least. Let's see what you suggested. The move which most of you suggested was knight e4 with the idea knight c5. This is not right. So it's possible to put the knight on c5, but first the knight can be exchanged on c5, and it's not so clear if your bishop is better than this knight on d5. So the knight has a very good square on b4. You can never, let's imagine this, I don't know. Let's keep the move again. Queen b6, knight c5, take. But let's say you take with the queen, or with the pawn, knight b4 is possible in some lines. Let's say you take with the queen, then take, we have this endgame. Then after knight b4, it's not so clear. I don't think that you are actually better here. Even if you have this square d6 for the rook, I can come with the king on e7. Nothing special. The bishop, it's very hard for the bishop to attack the pawn on b7, which is the only potential weakness. So, and the knight on c5 in many endgames could be weak. So this is something that you should avoid. Taking with the pawn, I don't think that it's different. Even immediate, probably knight b4 is possible, or first queen c7, it's not changing much, and then knight b4. So this one is wrong. The next one, e4 was suggested a few times. e4 is also not a good move. Now, when you play e4, first you close your bishop on f3. You cannot play knight e4 anymore. And after, let's say, I think knight b6 here. It's very simple. Then the pawn on d4 needs protection. So how to protect this pawn? You need to make moves like, I don't know, queen d3, queen d2, knight e2, something like that. Then he has knight e2, queen a4 probably. So it's not simple at all here to find anything for white. I think black could be better here after e4. So there are two plans. Grishchuk showed them both, but he started with the move h4. Remember, it's very important that h6 is also included. When you see h6, you can play h4. In the next game between those two players, Grishchuk and Dominguez, they have the same position or similar position, and somehow Dominguez managed to play h5 here. Here it's not possible, knight f6 and h5. It looks anti-positional. We put the pawn on the light square, and we're not threatening g4, g5 anymore, but this is the right plan. Let's see why. The idea is that now black wants somehow to make a battery, white wants somehow to make a battery, let's imagine queen d3 and bishop c2. And then g6 is no longer possible. So this pawn on h5 give us, make black's king weaker. Even in some endgames, it's very good to have this pawn here, but the main idea is to have, let's say, queen d3, bishop c2, or queen e4, bishop e2, bishop d3 in some lines. So black is totally out of counterplay. Let's say after knight c3, just b takes c3. This was pointed by many of you, and then the pawn on b7 is hanging. What if black plays c5? c5 is also a move that usually you don't want to make, because this pawn on c6 restricts the bishop here. I'm not 100% sure bishop b7 or d takes c5, but the pawn on b7 is hanging. I have the square b5, and even d5 makes some sense here with some position like that, which could be very unpleasant. This opposites covered middle games. Now you see the pawn on h5 is also quite good. Yeah, I think c5 is not a good move. Dominguez here, he played rook c7. The passive strategy here is probably the best. You want to put rook on d7 just to stay. And then the second part of the plan. Knight is going in these positions or b3 or on d3. So here on b3 doesn't make sense because the pawn is hanging. Grischuk starts to maneuver the knight to d3. F4, knight d5. And he's okay to exchange on f4 because then he could create some threats again. Queen e4, bishop e2, bishop d3, also king h2, rook g1. Then the black's king is in danger here. Bishop d6 and knight d3. So stopping c4 forever, c5 forever, sometimes knight e5, sometimes knight c5, sometimes b4 is an idea. Knight b4, okay, here it was, cannot avoid the exchange. Now he could play somewhere the knight, but he decides to enter this opposite cover middle game where black's king is in danger. Bishop e7, bishop b1, and you see finally the queen will come on the next move on c2 or on d3, d3, bishop f6. Okay, queen h7 here is not giving much, but Grischuk played queen c5, take, rook c4. Even in this endgame, the king is kind of weak all the time. So now the idea is bishop e4, rook moves, b4, take, and start attacking the pawn on b7. So Dominguez play active, he takes c5, b4 now, bishop f5, bishop c8, yeah, bishop b7, bishop d5. This position is quite unpleasant, again, because of the king. King is very weak. Okay, and after some complications, the game was drawn at some point, but Grischuk managed to win that. So, yeah, there are some weaknesses, and he sacrificed the pawn, and Grischuk managed to win this endgame, even though that it was probably drawn. So let's go back to the starting position on this line. Here you have two correct plans. One is immediately to transfer the knight to d3, but this doesn't give you much. And the other is the move played by Grischuk, h4, h5, making the king weak. Then knight to d3. At some point we're trying b4. The other idea is to start attacking the king by making this battery bishop c2 or bishop b1 and queen d3. Again, here it doesn't really matter what the computer says. The computer always is equal or slightly better for white, something like that, but it doesn't really matter. So this is the correct approach. And now we'll see two games of Roslav Wojtaszek. He's a very strong theoretician, very strong player, and he's a big fan of Catalan for white. This time the open variation, bishop g2, bishop d7, and first we'll see the position after short castle. Knight e5 is the main move. Next position is with knight e5. But first, let's see this one. Bishop c6, queen c2, knight b7, queen c4. So there's one rule in Catalan that if we manage to win this pawn on c4 without any positional concessions, I mean without playing a4, or without allowing black to play a6, b5, and bishop b7, something like that. Let's say if in this position the bishop is on c8, this is a very big advantage. So that's why black is always trying to do something, to attack the center, to protect the pawn on c4, just not to give it for free. And this is one of those cases. Here, okay, black managed to put the bishop on the diagonal, but white took the pawn without playing a4. So this is a very big difference from the Grishchuk's game. It's more or less the same structure. Now the threat is e4, followed by d5. So bishop f3, take c6. And then if we play a4, after a5, we'll get into something similar to the Grishchuk's game. But of course, no one is playing a4 here. This position with the pawn still on a2, the pawn can go on a3. So black has no good squares for the pieces. d5 is not safe because always c4 is coming, and b4 is not available. This is big advantage. The game is Grishchuk-Mamedov. Okay, probably not that big, but free advantage. Let's say white is better without any compensation. There is no counterplay. Again, always c5, d5 is opening. We open the position. Mamedov tried to play passive knight f8. This move you are not making if you have something better. Knight a4, b4, okay. Knight c5. Then if you play queen b6, the position is just very bad. a4 is coming. He decided to take. But then after b takes c5, the plan here is to bring one bishop to d6. Probably with a4 to open the queen side. So Mamedov went for some complications and simply lose that. Two bishops are much stronger than two knights in this position. Now we have a passed pawn, bishop f4, d1, bishop e3, bishop d4. Okay, we can skip the rest of the game. There are two passed pawns on A and B file, but they're not doing much. So we take one, d8, rook e8, and queen e4 is winning the rook. So this game I will show you just to show this rule. If we manage to take the pawn, to reach this position without the pawn on a4, it's a big advantage. So with white, you should try to reach this, with black to avoid it. This is close to equal, probably very tiny advantage for white, but very close to equal. And this is much better for white. Okay, and now let's see some more dynamic options. Knight e5, starting from bishop d7. This is one of the recent trends, probably Borisov Ruch will tell you something about that, or at least it was a few years ago. Bishop c6. Black voluntarily gave the bishop. Always this was considered suspicious. But the main idea was that here, after long castle, e3, long castle, if you continue queen a4, black is playing knight d5, and if queen c4, black is playing h5, and start playing for mate. So the position is quite tricky. I think black is fine. So the main thing is that you cannot stop h4, because g5, h5, g5, take. This is already winning for black. Black's attack is very fast. If you play something like knight d2, bishop d2, knight d2, bishop d2, he's playing h4, I don't know, a3, some stupid move, and then take, f5, then g5, then queen h7, f4, and I play that in blitz many times. Yeah, someone said, Moment said that this position is fine for white. Probably theoretically it's fine, but I think in practice this is quite unpleasant, and the strong players start to avoiding that. The top players, at least. So also the point here is that you can never play e4 because of knight b6, and then you lose the d4 pawn. And Wojtaszek, and I think Topalov also had some games, found the move knight d2 here instead of instead of queen a4. Doesn't light square bishop prevent a lot of mating threats? Yeah, the light square bishop, without the bishop, it would be really bad. It's a big fight, so opposite castling, and the light square bishop is trying to prevent the mating threat, but it's not so easy. So if you give few moves of black, black will play g5, f5, f4, and the problem starts. Queen h7. And in the meantime, it's not so easy to attack black's king. So that's why here they tried now knight d2. The move played by Wojtaszek. So if the knight came on c4, here is a little bit different. So this one is just knight c4. We're not wasting time to go there with the queen. The knight is well placed. So e5 is a typical move. Usually, when white is trying to get the pawn back, black is strike again in the center with e5. And now, what to do? If we take, this is terrible. Knight e5, cannot win the pawn. The knight, it's not so clear what the knight is doing here. It's still playable probably, but it's not good. d5 is not possible. Knight c4. This is a pawn sacrifice. Here, e takes d4 is also possible. Queen a4 was the move played by Wojtaszek. This was a novelty at the time, I think. And it posed some serious problems. Here, black cannot even dream for any attack. Okay, black is a pawn up. You can take on e3, but then bishop e3, rook c1, b4, knight a5. It looks very dangerous, please. You could play bishop c5, but then b4 is strong. So knight b4, queen b3. We sacrifice two pawns, but opponent files against the king. And this is also, I'm not sure what's the theoretical evaluation, but it seems a bit scary. So the move played in the game was d3. Black has a pawn up, so this is the first position which we see with where we're sacrificing material. Black has a pawn up on d3, advanced, but there is no immediate threats, so white has a free hand. Rook d1. b4 was also possible, but Wojtaszek decided to play without any sacrificing. This is bishop d2, knight d5, rook c1, just bring the pieces, and then queen b3. It's a tricky move, queen b3. White wants to take the pawn, and if the material is equal, then black has no compensation about the bishop pair, and also the king could be still weak. Queen e6, trying not to allow queen d3, and knight e5. Very tricky move. It should be 6. Knight e5, rook c5 is good. All right. And the structure is ruined. The king is very weak, and then rook c4, nice move. So white's strategy is basically not to create immediate threats, but simply to improve the position. The idea is to play rook c1 and just to ignore this pawn on d3, rook c1 threatening the pawn on c6, and then a4, a5. So c5 was played. It blocks the bishop, but what else? And then this diagonal is open, rook e4, queen d6, a4. So now after a5, bishop a5 is just a good move. Knight b4 was played, take, take, and white restored the material balance, but the position is completely winning. So here, you know, when we have opposite color bishops, the one who starts the attack first usually have a very big advantage. So it doesn't matter that this pawn is coming to d2 because there is no follow-up of that. And black's king is simply in trouble here. queen c2, a5, this wins a piece, rook b4. Rook b6 was also forced win, let's say something like that, but we're touching the steps to win without calculating anything. So this is a very common strategy in all those Catalans. Catalan is very similar opening to Grunfeld defense. So if we start, we see this position, take c4, and let's say c5, castles. Then we're somehow in Grunfeld with the reverse card. So in Grunfeld, you know, we sacrifice 1 or 2 pawns just for activity. Here is the same. White's plan is very simple: make the king safe on g1, and then on the queen side we can sacrifice material. Usually we sacrifice material even without the king there, but now with the king on c8, like in this line, it's just necessary to go for those sacrifices. So I think the line with knight d2 is stronger than queen a4, but it's matter of taste. Okay, now one other game of this line of the Chinese Grandmaster Yi, bishop c6, queen c2, knight d7, queen c4. Again, we discussed that this is not exactly equal if black cannot get any quick activity. So, for example, bishop e7, knight c3, rook e1. This is the position which we already saw. So this time, bishop d5 was queen d3, bishop e4. It's a well-known idea. Bishop is going to e4. Then we want to play c5 and go back with the bishop to c6. And then very interesting idea of Yi. Can you guess the correct move in this position? Okay, I see a lot of answers, but no one guessed the correct move still. Let me show you. This is quite counterintuitive. So if you play queen d1, which was suggested by most of you, then c5, let's say knight c3, and bishop is going back to c6. This is what black wants to reach. Queen b5 is even worse, I think, than that, because c5 and then bishop c6 is coming with tempo. Queen e3, somehow it blocks the bishop and the pawn is not going to e4. Queen d2 was the move played by Yi. What's the idea? The idea is that the knight is coming to c3, okay, of course, but a white keep this square d1 for the rook. So you see now how it's knight c3, bishop c6, and then rook d1. Again, we know here c takes d4 is usually not that good. Here we can take with the queen, can take also even with the knight in this position. So there are many options. Rook c8 was played, a3, a6. And how white should continue in this position? I'll give you 30 seconds because we have a lot of games. So how white should play? You should just develop the pieces, or you should try to find something fast. Very well, Albert. Yeah, the positional move is d takes c5, probably bishop c5, then b4, something like that. This doesn't look so dangerous for black. At least it looks acceptable. e4 here is the right move. We sacrifice a pawn to slow the development of our opponent's pieces. So we're threatening d5. It's absolutely necessary for him to take. Knight takes, bishop takes, queen e2. So if bishop f3, we're taking with the bishop, attacking the pawn on b7 and threatening d5. This looks very, very unpleasant. He played bishop d5 and then d takes c5. Some of you already guessed this move. D takes c5. The point here is that bishop c5 is losing due to rook d5. So here, knight c5 is possible, but still this one is looks quite unpleasant. So bishop e7, then b4. So yeah, there's a question, isn't it better to wait for bishop e7 before d takes c5? In this case, we shouldn't wait, because he cannot take with the bishop, actually. And we open a file, we create a direct threat we want to take. So if knight c5, then yeah, I think here we win by force by playing knight h4. Knight h4, the threat is rook d5. If bishop e7, bishop d5, and then knight f5. This is just winning. Bishop b3 was played. And then you sacrifice an exchange, bishop g5, queen c7, c6. It's a very good attacking game. So he's even not thinking about moving the rook. Knight d4, giving the rook on d1. Finally, black took it. Knight e5, bishop for bishop d6, and knight c6. So knight c6 is, bishop d6 is very bad, or even rook d6. f6, queen takes a6. Castles. And black has bishop pair, two passed pawns. b5, queen a5, bishop f3, b6, b7, queen b6, queen g6, and king g2. Here, black resigned. There, probably the simplest threat is a4. You can play positionally. Black has no counterplay at all. So another case where this is very instructive example. We want to play e4 and d5 very quickly. We're not wasting time for moves like queen e1. So even here on this move, e4 was possible. In this structure, we can sacrifice a pawn and play for initiative and quick development. Okay, and then we go to the positions, which, let's see, e6, the position which was, this is not exactly Catalan, but it's very close. It's from semi-Slav we reach it. 5 castles here. There's a theory, let's not waste time. Knight c6 is not very good. Bishop b7, and then the most common pawn sacrifice in Catalan. Do you know what it is? What's the best move here for white? Yeah, obvious. Right, b3. So let's talk a little bit about this b3. One thing about b3, it's always good. So in 99% of the cases, after d takes c4, you provoke b5, and then you play b3. In 99% of the cases, this one gives you compensation. So I'm not saying that white is always better or something like that, but it always works. So if you don't know what to do, always after b5, b3 is the move. You don't want to win the pawn back on c6 or on c4 or something like that. This is pawn sacrifice, long-term compensation. So a takes b3. Here, exactly in this position, I think critical is b4. Right now, there's a discussion here. You can even sacrifice a piece. There's a game like that. Very interesting. Rook b1 or to some knight e4, c3, and black is trying to prove that this pawn on c3 compensate for all the weaknesses. Let's say 3 is played here. Take, it takes b4. I don't remember the exact here. It's not important. But we're talking about this position now. This structure is very, very common. The sacrifice appear always in Catalan, and it's always good. This is the verdict. So what is the idea? We have two semi-open files, A and C file, to attack. Also, we can take with the queen sometimes. We have two semi-open files. This bishop on b7 is very bad. And we have free development. So the bishop can go to b2, the rook to d1. The only thing that we should try to avoid is we shouldn't allow black to play c5. Let's say just remove those arrows. We shouldn't allow black to play c5. And black should always try to play c5, even if black is sacrificing a pawn like that. Let's see how this game went. This is the most famous game in this structure, probably. It's Kramnik against Giri. English Giri, bishop e7, bishop b2, castles, queen c2. And here Nishgiri played knight f7, and this was the position which I gave you. Yeah, what is the plan here? This move knight f7 was suspicious. Black is not developing a piece. Very well. Yeah, so the knight is very, very well placed on d3. We want to play knight e4 next. Sometimes we play b4, sometimes we even play bishop e3. Queen b6. c5 is still possible, so knight e4 to stop it. Now c5, it could be played, but then with this protected pass pawn here, white is better. So Giri played a5. Black's chances is to play something like a5, b4, knight a5, or a5, knight a6, rook c8, something like that. And here Kramnik played an instructive move. What do you think? What Kramnik played here? Someone said bishop a3 and oops, drop at d4. So don't worry, this pawn on d4 we also sacrifice it a lot. So it's I'm not saying that that's good, but it's possible. Yeah, rook fd1, a lot of options. Strangely enough, you didn't guess Kramnik's move. He played knight d to c5. What is the idea now? He didn't exchange knights on. Yeah, first, let's discuss bishop a3. So bishop a3, I think it's a little bit slow. First, b4 could be played right now, or with or without the exchange, b4, and then you gave a tempo and probably knight a6. So you just gave two tempos. Okay, you have this c4 square, but still. Knight c5. So the idea, if you take on c5, then he is taking with the pawn. And suddenly, we're switching to play on the king side. Yeah. So you can play h4, queen c3 at some point, knight g5, something like that, or rook d1, knight d6. This position is quite unpleasant again. Also, knight c5 is possible. So playing moves like f5, which was the engine suggestion, is very strange. Knight e6, knight f8, queen e4. This looks very, very dangerous. There are four pieces sleeping on the queen side. And somehow The bishop is hanging, some d5 is coming, the pawn on g7. It looks a little bit dangerous, at least to me. And also f5 is a move which black usually don't want to make to weaken this pawn so much. So bishop c8 played Giri, the most solid move. And then queen c3, threatening d5, so b4 now, and queen e3. Kramnik fixed the queen side and also stopped knight a6, knight b4. Then knight a6, rook fc1, keep an eye on this pawn on a5, so still leaving the rook on c1. And again, if knight c5, take with the pawn and rook d1. This is very good. Queen b5 was possible. But on knight c7, Giri wants to play knight d5. And then we're changing. So there's such term in chess literature, which is a redundant piece. So two pieces are wants to go to the same square. Those two knights wants to go to c5. So we exchange one and then put the other one. Those positions are always terrible, always. So here there's an immediate win, bishop g7 and queen g5 with some mates, then rook c4. But even if the pawn was on f6, let's say we skip the move, the pawn is on f6, this is just terrible. Rook d1, and if knight is going to d5, then we'll play e4 sooner or later, so this is very good. Bishop e8 played Giri, and Kramnik played rook a2. Tricky move again, waiting move. So we are so much better position, really. It's not seen what exactly black can do, so Kramnik improved the position. He could play rook from a2 to c2 or rook from c1 to a1 later on. Queen b5, and then strange decision, bishop e4 was possible. But Kramnik decided to go for queen d3 for an endgame. Looks strange, but okay, we'll take the pawn back, most probably. The pawn on a5 is quite weak, the pawn on c6, so knight d5, knight e5, rook e6, and bishop f1, threatening e4 to win a piece. Knight c3, Giri already returned the material, rook c3, two weaknesses, c5, Kramnik took this one as well, bishop f6, f4, bishop b5, bishop g2, rook a7, and c6. Okay, now white is a pawn up, completely winning position. Bishop e4, knight f3, e3, take, rook c1, so one more weakness. a4, and after b takes a4, Giri resigned. So a4 probably was a blunder, but this position is anyway very, very bad. So if rook a4 take, c7 is winning. If bishop a4, probably rook c4 is winning. Okay, so this was our model game. We sacrificed the pawn on b3 for nothing concrete, just for long-term positional compensation. And I want to show you more examples like that. There's a game of the young Dennis Wagner, young talented German player. This is some line. b5 was provoked, and then again b3. So I tell you, almost every time this one is good. C takes b3. This time we're not taking with the pawn, we're taking with the queen. So c6 is almost necessary because after bishop e6, knight e5 is unpleasant at some point. Take, and knight e5, the knight is going to c6. If knight e5, bishop a8. So c6, and we reach our structure. And then very simple, rook is going to c1, bishop is going to b7, queen is going to b2, leaving the square b3 for the knight. So knight b3, knight c5 is coming. And here, if knight d7, can you guess the correct move for white, the correct plan for white? We want to reach similar position to Kramnik's game. Well, first, knight e5 is a move that probably can be avoided because it exchanged one piece somehow. A4 was suggested several times. A4, you don't have a threat here because imagine that I skip the move. You take, take, take. This is not that bad. Actually, bishop a6. The pawn into is hanging. Probably it will be some kind of draw. Or even b4. Okay, give c4 square, but we have a passed pawn. 91. Many of you guessed the move. 91. Knight is going to d3. Very similar to Kramnik's game. Some e5 here. It's a complicated position. Probably it's okay for black theoretically, but over the board, I played many times this position with both colors, and over the board is always easier to play with the initiative, not with the material. So knight a6 was played instead of knight d7, and then knight e5. Then the pawn on c6 falls, and this is already very difficult. Because now, compared to these variations with a4, it takes b5, the pawn on a3 is alive for now. But if he play b4, then most probably he will lose the pawn later on a5. Yeah, if queen b8, then knight b3. Those endgames are always quite unpleasant. This is another structure which I want to show you this one. Yeah. So 5 against 4, this is quite typical, and one pawn on the queen side. So if you don't know those positions, you can think that probably black is okay because this is a passed pawn and it can go forward. But usually this pawn is just a weakness. So this pawn is a weakness, and if we manage to win this pawn, then the endgame of 5 against 4 is very, very hard, probably even lost. Also, the bishop is much stronger than the knights. Yeah. A4 was tried, rook c4, and yeah, this is bad. E4. The knight probably needs to move somewhere, but it's not clear here. The knight on b4 is hanging. E3, probably queen b3, rook b8, take, take. It's not enough compensation somehow. Probably here rook b8 was better move, just to give the pawn on a4 and try to survive this one. Yeah, queen a5, e4 is winning a piece. Okay, not a piece, but then it's very strange here. This knight on d3 is hanging all the time. He just resigned. Rook b3, yeah, this is a piece up. So it looks very simple. Let's see, when we sacrifice the pawn, if later somehow we manage to win the pawn back without exchanging the bishops, this is very good for white. Let me show you another example here. Yeah, this is this position. b5, b3, all the time the same. Again, c6. Yeah, here the same thing. We're playing slowly, so just a3. We need to take, take. And we're playing slowly. We're not rushing with e4 and b4. Now this one is very weak. in the appropriate moment, you take it, but not immediately. Not immediately. Bishop e4, trying to play on both flanks, on the king side, on the queen side. So, and this is a very good game. Benjamin Gledura is with white, and he managed to create some threats on the king side, and the pawn on c6 is always weak, needs to be protected. And finally, Black loses not because of the weakness of the pawn on c6, because his king is very weak. Bishop d5, rook d5, and it was complicated, but Black's king is weaker, and finally a white pawn. Sorry for going so quickly through this game. You can see it with some comments, but I want to show you one more structure. I was planning to show you some of my games in this position, but there's no time for that. I will show you how to take, very good question, how to take, how to know when to take on b3 with the pawn or with the a2 pawn. It depends on the situation. I think taking with the queen is more common. Sometimes it's not possible because d4 is hanging. Because taking with the queen leaves the option to play a4, but also taking with the pawn is fine. As we see, there is no rule about that. You need to think according to the situation. But almost always, even if you see this is quite a trendy line, Grishchuk also played that way with white. b6, if knight e5, then queen d4, black sacrifice an exchange, and so on and so on. And that way, you can grab the initiative. Knight d2, you already know, if we manage to win this pawn in this structure, without losing 100 templates with the queen, so if we manage to take knight c4, then this is better for white. So he needs to protect it. And then b3. And all the time you need to look for c3. c3, knight e4. Here the trick is that you need to play a3 immediately when black is not able to play a5. So now, it's such case, a5, you take, and okay, he cannot take with the pawn. This position could be unpleasant because the pawn on c3, it's a long-term strand, and yeah, it's very unpleasant to play against such pawn, even if it's possible. It's possible, there are a lot of lines like that. But okay, let me show you. We have not so much time to show you one more structure, which I thought that we have more time, but it's a lot of material. So the structure is this one, 95. This is another modern continuation, 95. Probably most of you know what's the best way to react here. Entering the position with c5, d takes c5 is not good again. Here the evaluation of this position is between slight advantage and big advantage for white. All the time this bishop is very strong. So knight c6 is the move which was played. Let's discuss this move somehow. A little. It will look very strange for the one who doesn't know exactly why this is played. So this move forces taking on c6. So knight c4 is not possible because of knight d4. And white has a choice, knight c6 or bishop c6. There is this line, take, and queen a4, queen c2, doesn't matter, when black is losing a pawn. Black is losing the pawn on c4, but we already played bishop takes c6, and now without the bishop on g2, the king side is weak. So all the time, let's say black is playing something like e5, bishop h3, or bishop b7, say something like It's like that. Always black has good compensation. You can check there are hundreds, if not thousands of games in this position. You can check some games of Peter Leko. I remember that he equalizes quite easy here. But yeah, it's not so simple. In the 5 you will find one game here how white win this position. This with his structural advantage. He managed to play f3 to secure his king and later win. Also, there is an interesting game, Fabiano Caruana Nakamura. You can see when white played with long castle, the same structure. But okay, let's get back because we are totally out of time. So the other taking after knight c6 is knight takes c6. For me, this always looks somehow more logical to keep the bishop on g2. But what's the problem? If you take again, then this move, okay, it wins a pawn, but those 3 pawns are actually not valuable at all. There are a lot of lines where black has those 3 pawns after taking on c6. And with this pawn on c6 or without it, it's more or less the same. So it just gives a tempo, black to play rook b8, later try to exchange this bishop from d7, from b7, and to play c5, trying to exchange everything in the center. So in this line, and in this structure, we are trying to take the pawn on c4. This is the pawn which is actually important. If we manage to take it without allowing c5, then we're better. So what to do? If knight d2, probably queen d4 is possible. If queen c2, this is too slow. We don't want to take it with the queen. Always when the queen is on c4, there's some bishop a6 or some tactics. Again, queen d4 here deserves attention, probably. So knight a3 is the theory, and we reach one of the strangest structures. Here, if you allow, I had games with bishop a6, let's say something like that. This is very, very bad. Something like that, it's really bad. We want the pawn back, and he has no compensation for this one. So this position is good even if we're without the pawn on d4 probably, but with the pawn on d4 this is very, very good. So he needs to take it. We have bishop pair, but you see it's a very strange structure. 3 pawns on the c file, 2 pawns on the e file, a lot of weaknesses on the king side. What we have? We have 2 bishops, so bishop pair, and we have some objects to attack those guys. And in this position, there are quite a lot of games. Actually, white tried. The theory considers here to move rook b8 the best. White, as I told you, we're not. Black is not trying to protect the pawn on c6. Black is even happy if white takes this pawn. Let's say if you take it, bishop b7, then exchange it. And then at some point c5 or queen d5, and it will be probably a draw. So now, one of again the strange play here continue, and we need to find a good square for that queen. Queen c2 is dropping the pawn. It can be a sacrifice, but okay, it probably will be too much. Queen a4, the same thing. So they found another very strange move, queen d2. What is the idea of this? We want to go with the queen to a5. Some point. Want to continue a4, bishop a3, then rook c1, taking the pawn, taking this one, and try to use our bishop pair. Bishop a6. This is my game, Gersman. Queen c8, bishop a3, rook e8, strange move. Rook needs to be on d8 to create some counterplay. And then, okay, with the rook on e8, he basically forced me to take this pawn because it's with tempo and I cannot. And rook c1, and now with equal material, you see, with equal material, even if those pawns are doubled, we have bishop pair, and those pawns are weak. Most probably we will win them. Queen a5, so we see all the ideas in life. Yeah. And this e5, d takes e5, queen d2. Here it looks that black is very good position, pawn up, and rook is active, but actually those bishop pairs are very strong, and those pieces are not doing much. White's threat is rook d1, and the knight is hanging. White's threat is bishop h3. The position is completely winning. c5 was played, bishop h3, rook e7, rook fd1, rook b7, queen d6, and here my opponent resigned. So this is another structure which you should have in mind. Somehow we take on c6. We reach those 2 pawns or 3 pawns. And then the strongest move is knight a3. We're trying to exploit our bishop pair, those weak pawns. In general, in Catalan, so let's summarize. All the time, if we manage to win this pawn back, let's say if after knight bd2, he just play rook e8, for example. Just to give you an example. If now knight c4, this position is always good for white. This is what you want to read. If the material is equal, and we manage to win the pawn back on c4 without any positional concessions and without allowing him to put the bishop on b7 and c6, we're better. So there is a big fight how to win the pawn, and can he attack the center at that time, and so on and so on. Okay, guys, unfortunately, we need to finish now. I show you probably less than 50% of the games which I prepared for today. Yeah, probably we can do another masterclass about Catalan. I don't know. I will add some of them in the PGN file. You can also see I tried not to repeat the same structures as Michael Marin. Yeah, there are, of course, a lot more structures than that, but those were, I think, the one with B3 is very important. Now this is super trendy, especially with these computers and strong engines. You can see games of Daniel Dubov. He's playing B3 basically against everything. The other, this open center, is absolute classic. You need to know how to play it. And also the other positions with small advantage, which we saw Grishchuk's games and so on and so on. Okay, I will leave you for now. You can stay in the chat, and in 25 minutes, Grandmaster Marin will start his lecture. I hope that, you'll learn something.